Alright, that concludes our opening discussion, and now I'd like you all to take out your books. As I told you, we'll be starting these from today. Everyone brought their copy, I hope?
Professor, I'm sorry, I don't...
Yes?
I don't have the book with me today.
Why not?
I just forgot to bring mine.
Yeah, no, I forgot to bring mine too.
Class, I believe I told you very distinctly last Friday that we would be starting to look at progressive rock from the beginning, and this is the prescribed book. Some of you haven't brought it? Fine. For this morning, you can share with a partner. Bring it by the next class. There's going to be homework. Make sure you get it before then. Take notes. Let's begin. Greetings everyone, I'm Peter Scove. This is Music is a Journey, episode 13, the first episode of 2019. Is everybody ready for the new year? I think I am more or less. Ready for the new year. Okay, so if we're all more or less ready, let's get started with episode 13. Cue the music. So, back in episode 12, I let it slip that I'm kind of new to the progressive rock spectrum of music. Even though the first 12 episodes we've been focusing on contemporary progressive rock recording artists mostly, I'm really kind of new to this. I started out becoming interested in music back when I was about 11 years old or so. I started paying attention to what I heard on the radio, what was on television, and also what I heard through my friends and their older brothers. However, I was introduced to hard rock and heavy metal. So for the first few years, my latter days in elementary school and throughout junior high school, I was really interested in heavy metal. However, I always found the longer compositions and the songs that seemed to branch out a bit more and do more were the songs that really captivated my interest. Songs like Iron Maiden's Phantom of the Opera, or some of the older recordings by Judas Priest, some recordings by Black Sabbath like Sign of the Southern Cross, where they had a kind of intro and then they led into the main part of the song, but then in the middle there was some change, something else happened. I really like those kinds of songs, and so probably very naturally I became interested in the music of Pink Floyd, later on the Moody Blues, the Alan Parsons Project, and a lot of the so-called proto-prog bands of the late 60s, for example, Jefferson Airplane, Iron Butterfly, Vanilla Fudge. But during all this time, I never knew that these were progressive rock bands or associated with progressive rock, even as I got into like Uriah Heep, of course classic Deep Purple, older Deep Purple from the Mark I period. I never heard the terms progressive rock, even when I read Circus Magazine, Hit Parader. It was always hard rock and heavy metal. So strangely enough, it wasn't until I watched an Austin Powers movie when Dr. Evil talks about this laser developed by Alan Parsons, and so he's named it the Alan Parsons Project. And at this time, his son Scott says, Alan Parsons Project was a progressive rock band of the 80s. That was the first time I heard the term progressive rock. Now, around 2010, I suddenly became very interested in Rush, and I started to read as much as I could about the band, and of course, I was introduced to the term progressive rock, and I was led to checking out bands like Yes and Genesis, and from there on things just really exploded, because suddenly I realized there was this whole world of music out there that I had just barely tapped into. And of course it was really cool to find out that a lot of the bands that I liked, or songs that I liked, were actually associated with progressive rock. For example, Queensryche, and even some of Metallica's songs, say from Master of Puppets especially, were also classified as progressive rock. And it was fun to actually go through the prog archives and think, okay, how about Blue Oyster Cult? Are they here? Oh, yes they are. How about the Tea Party? Are they here? Oh, yes they are. So the Prog Archives website was really helpful in introducing me to all kinds of progressive rock bands, from the early classic bands up to what was coming out very recently. But it's also overwhelming because there are tens of thousands of albums on there and thousands upon thousands of artists. So I wanted something to kind of guide me through the center in a way. And I happened to find, I was looking for books on progressive rock, and that's when I found Citizens of Hope and Glory, The Story of Progressive Rock by Stephen Lambe. Okay, so there were a few books on progressive rock, but it seems that most of them focused on really the history of the genre, and then the history of the classic period of the genre. And I was looking for a book to kind of take me through all the way up to modern times. And this book actually turned out to be the book to get. One of the things that I really like about this book is, as Stephen Lambe points out in the beginning, this is very much a personal journey. This is how he got into progressive rock in the late 70s, and how he got to know about many of the bands. He does talk about the history of progressive rock, but not in great detail. He mentions the basic early developments of the late 60s, then when things really came into form from, say, 1969 up to the mid-70s. He takes us through the beginning of the decline, and then through the 80s, and then brings us into the 90s with a kind of progressive rock revival, and takes us up to about 2008, 2009. So by now this book is already about 10 years old. However, I still think it's really great for bringing you up more or less to modern times. And I would say the difficult thing is that since about 2008, 2009, progressive rock has really taken on a world of its own, a life of its own, and there are just so many recording artists out there all over the world who are producing terrific albums, a few of which I've been able to introduce on this show, the first 12 episodes. So it must be really hard to continue from 2008. But anyway, let's talk about Citizens of Hope and Glory. One of the things Stephen Lambe points out in the book is that the progressive rock movement was originally largely an English thing. Now, this is not to ignore the so-called krautrock movement, which was Germany's own take on developing rock music into something more. And also, of course, the Italian progressive rock movement, which is discussed briefly in the book. But it is largely an English phenomenon, and he also basically sticks with symphonic prog, going a little bit outside from that here and there where it's important in the development of the genre, but basically he sticks with symphonic prog bands. And throughout the book, he not only discusses very important albums, but he specifically picks out about 62 albums, which he gives a kind of separate review about. So this introduced me to a lot of groups I'd heard about, a lot of groups I'd never heard about, and was a kind of guidebook for albums that I might want to check out and groups that I might want to check out to find out more about. So for this episode here, which is quite likely going to be broken into about 3 parts, I suspect, I'd like to go through the albums that are mentioned in here, give my opinion based on my experience with them, hopefully introduce them to anybody who is new to progressive rock and wants to find out more, and probably get some criticism from people who already into it and disagree with what I have to say. But at the same time, I'm also going to point out some of the phrases or some of the comments by Stephen Lambe as well. So let's get on with it, and the first album we're going to talk about is this classic, In the Court of the Crimson King by King Crimson, the debut album in 1969. I had seen this album cover in stores, but I had no idea what kind of music it was. Of course, I've heard the opening track, 21st Century Schizoid Man, including mirrors. Didn't know it was including mirrors. But anyway, this, of course, is a classic track, easily recognizable. And for someone like me coming from a heavy metal background, very easy to latch onto this one right away. Really heavy riffs, pounding song, acerbic vocals, just so much energy and power in it. And of course then it breaks into this like really wild kind of freestyling jazz part, which actually I thought was really terrific. So the first song on here, easily a winner for me. Now we move on to track 2, I Talk to the Wind, and right away we are dropped down into something very gentle and light, very English sounding. For me that was fine. It's quite a contrast. However, I like that. I like that they went and did something totally different. Not that the song itself is a real winner for me, but anyway. Then we move on to track 3, Epitaph. Now this one is also a slow one. So we're talking about one heavy hitter and then 2 slow songs. But Epitaph, I guess because of the subject matter, is also has this more moody atmosphere to it with mellotron and so on. So actually I quite like this one as well. However, we move on to Moonchild, including The Dream and the Illusion, and this is another very slow, mellow track. So at this point my attention is starting to wane. And then we get into this experimental section where it's like, this person plays some notes, and this person does something, and this person plays some notes, and a little bit over here. And I guess this is the dream sequence, but I think a lot of people get lost in here. And fine for doing something new and experimental, or adding something in to rock music, which probably wasn't there so much before. However, this is the point where some listeners might think, where's the skip button? However, we finally move on to the Court of the Crimson King, including the Return of the Fire Witch and the Dance of the Puppets. Alright, this is for me where the album finally kicks back in again. It's not a heavy track, but it is a very powerful track with mellotron coming in like a very symphonic element and lots of emotion. So at least for the first and last track, I like it. And the middle track, Epitaph, yeah, that's alright too. Other people, this is the progressive rock album to get. This is one of the most frequently highly rated albums. So whether you're interested or not, if you want to get into progressive rock and want to know from the beginnings of it, this is probably an album at least to check out. Okay, now the second album mentioned in the book is Trespass by Genesis, which I haven't got yet. I do have quite a few Genesis albums. I don't have Trespass yet. So we're going to move along and take a look at the Yes album. This is Yes's third album. This is the first album with Steve Howe on guitar, the last album with Tony Kaye on keyboards. This is probably the first step where the band takes the ideas that they had developed on their first 2 albums and really start to put it towards where they were going to go. And I actually had this on cassette around 1989 or so. And songs like Perpetual Change, Yours Is No Disgrace, Starship Trooper, these are songs that actually stayed with me after I got rid of my cassettes. Those songs still could pop into my head from time to time, especially Starship Trooper. So when I really got into Yes in 2011, hearing this album again was like meeting up with an old friend. So, what does Stephen Lambe have to say about the Yes album? All adherence to simple song structure had disappeared. Here was the multi-part, multi-layered, symphonic, progressive rock album in all its multicolored, melodic glory. Yes, finally fulfilling its potential. Let's move on now to Caravans in the Land of Grey and Pink, their third album. This is actually fairly new to my collection. I only just got it a few months back, and I've only listened to it about 2 or 3 times. But right away, I noticed how similar it sounded to Hatfield in the North. And I think it's because of Richard Sinclair's vocals. Of course, he is the vocalist for Hatfield in the North, so that ties that together. One of the things that struck me was the music is not exceptionally complicated. It's not like what Genesis and Yes were doing. It's not as experimental as what King Crimson were doing. It is fairly straightforward music with lots of good instrumental parts. I guess because there is a jazz influence and some hints of, I guess, more English style, not quite folk, but anyway, it makes it different from mainstream stuff, of course. The lyrics are also sometimes quite quirky and interesting. The final track, 9 Feet Underground, which is all of side 2, does have a lot of keyboard soloing and is in several parts. So I guess for that, it certainly does make this a progressive rock album. But what's interesting is that because it's different from Yes, and it's different from Genesis, and different from King Crimson, it does give you an idea of how diversified progressive rock was right off from the start. Stephen Lambe's comments. So, about 9 Feet Underground, a masterpiece of original pyrotechnics and groove bolstered by piano in its later sections. So now we're going to move on to another great classic progressive rock band, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, shortened ELP, and their second studio album, Tarkus. Tarkus is probably one of the preeminent progressive rock albums specifically for the side-long, side-one track Tarkus, which goes in multiple parts. It shows the band probably displaying their skills at their highest with, of course, Keith Emerson's keyboards, Carl Palmer's drumming, and Greg Lake's playing of bass. I think there might be some guitar, his vocals, and the songwriting as well. This is one of those tracks that you really must hear to understand what was going on in progressive rock back in the early days. Now, side 2, it's quite all over the place. We have some tracks similar to side 1. A Time and the Place is probably one of my favorites because it's almost like early heavy metal but without guitars. Bitches Crystal also is similar to what we heard on side 1, but Jeremy Bender and Are You Ready, Eddie, quite different sounding tracks. Interesting that the band is doing them. They do kind of stand out a little bit here as possibly being out of place. What does Stephen Lambe have to say about Tarkus? A stupendous piece of work, hugely intense and complex. As well as the amazing complexity of the piece, it's the drama of it that works best. The intensity beautifully judged against the vocal sections to produce passages of real majesty. He also says side 2 is not as good, with some songs keeping up ELP's good name and others lesser so. There are too many styles on side 2. If we're talking about big names in early progressive rock, Gentle Giant is one of those names we need to consider, of course. And this, their second album, Acquiring the Taste. What a saucy looking cover. However, if you have the gatefold album that folds all the way out, you can see what the illustration really shows. I'm fairly new to Gentle Giant. Not quite, no. I think I first started listening to them about 2013, but I've never really delved in. I think I have 3 albums so far. Actually, I find this one to be one of the easiest ones to listen to, and partly because most of the songs are, in their core, an early 70s rock song. Then there are all sorts of little frills and tassels and things put on to kind of develop the basic song further. But none of them, or few of them, really go outside into new territory. It's like dressing up before really going there. So I actually find this album really good to listen to and very easy to get into. Perhaps one of the easier Gentle Giant albums to listen to, because they do go on to some experimental stuff, which they do on here. The Street, the House, the Street, the Room is possibly one of my favorite tracks and does have a bit of more of a heavy sound, a rock guitar and excellent guitar solo, but it has one of those sections where it's like the trumpet goes blah, 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 and the guitar goes dee, 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 and piano ding, 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 and some, vibraphone, boop, 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 and it's just da, 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 da. Okay, I'm making a fool of myself, but it's not really cool when the rest of the song has been grooving so well, in my opinion. So, what does Stephen Lambe have to say about Gentle Giant's acquiring the taste? One of the first rewards in the progressive rock era to forego jamming and rehearsal room composition in favor of a gradually compiled series of pieces. Inaccessible, but rewards with repeat listens. If you've been following so far and you're new to progressive rock, then coming to this album might be a bit of a shock. This is Van der Graaf Generator's Pawn Hearts. Again, one of the most highly acclaimed progressive rock albums. We have heard very beautifully structured music, we've heard good melodies, we've heard a lot of skill with instrumental ability, keyboards, guitars, drums, and everything. This album takes quite a different approach to progressive rock, and at first I didn't really think too much of this. However, listening to it again recently, I found I rather like this. First of all, we have Peter Hamill's vocals and keyboards, we have bass, we have drums, and we have saxophone. No guitars, except for where Robert Fripp from King Crimson appears on here as a guest briefly. It is not, however, like ELP, with lots of flashy keyboard playing and classical influences. A lot of this is really harsh, heavy, powerful keyboards, and I often felt that with regards to the keyboards, they are producing very rough, ragged, heavy, dark layers to support the lyrics. And Peter Hamill's vocal style is, of course, quite unique. Not quite singing, very theatrical. And basically then the lead work comes in through David Jackson's sax playing. So we hear lots of saxophone solos coming in. But again, there's this real edge to the music. Now, it does get soft and delicate at times, but it's almost like the mad person containing himself briefly and speaking about sunshine and butterflies before he starts to lose his grip on everything. Anyway, 3 tracks on here, 2 on side 1, and then A Plague of Lighthouse Keepers, 23 minutes and 5 seconds on side 2. If you get this CD here, there's a bunch of bonus tracks, which are also interesting, but I do find that the basic 3 tracks of the album are good enough, and definitely, if you are interested in hearing something a little bit darker and heavier and different than what we've talked about so far, definitely worth checking out. What does Stephen Lambe have to say about Pawn Hearts? Pawn Hearts is not an easy listen. Intense and often cacophonous, its fleeting moments of melody and reflection sometimes feel like welcome oases of calming after the din. Ignore this album at your peril. We now move along to Close to the Edge by Yes. This album, along with In the Court of the Crimson King by King Crimson, are 2 of the most highly rated progressive rock albums of all time. This is 3 tracks, Close to the Edge taking up all of side 1, and from my opinion, probably the most coherent and most well-composed side-long epic track ever. And I've heard quite a few, and a number of really good ones. For me, though, this still stands as my favorite. Alright, also probably the most outstanding Yes album, The Peak. This includes the classic lineup of John Anderson, Chris Squire, Steve Howe, Rick Wakeman, and Bill Bruford. And this was also the last album to feature Bill Bruford on drums. And in an interview, Bill Bruford said that it often takes bands a few albums to hit their peak. And he felt with this one here, Yes had reached its peak. And after this, he thought, okay, I don't need to stay with this band anymore. I'm going to move on. And of course, he moved on to play with King Crimson and appeared on some of their most stellar and reputable albums. I don't think I need to tell you Stephen Lambe's comments about this album. They basically are the same as mine. This is a masterpiece of progressive rock. I will mention Focus, Moving Waves. I haven't got it yet. It's on order, it's coming. And it's an album that I put off getting for a long time because I got Focus 3, which had a lot of parts I was not so thrilled about. However, it is mentioned, Moving Waves is mentioned in the book and does receive a fair bit of praise. So I'll be getting into that one soon, I hope. So let's move along now to Jethro Tull, Thick as a Brick. Of course, this album must be on here. And its story, as you probably have heard, and if you haven't, I'll tell you now, is quite interesting. The previous album, Aqualung, had some songs on that were of a common theme. And so the music press was saying that it was a concept album, and it was not intended to be one. So Ian Anderson, vocals, flute, and some acoustic guitar, he thought, all right, we're going to give them the mother of a concept album. And so Thick as a Brick is one song divided over two sides of the platter. And apparently, allegedly, the lyrics were written by an 8-year-old boy who is pictured in here for winning a poetry contest. Of course, that's all just part of the story. The original album actually featured a newspaper inside that the band had printed. Thick as a Brick, there is a very short version featuring the opening acoustic guitar and flute melody part, which I often heard on the radio. However, the full-length version is really quite a treat. Because it's over 43 minutes long, you do need that much time to sit down and listen to one song. But it is very rewarding. The changes in the music, how it goes to heavier stuff, to lighter, almost folk stuff, and then some classical influenced parts. It's really a treat. The only thing is that at the beginning of side 2, it's a little bit weird, and then we get a drum solo. If you are into early 70s rock, especially heavy rock, you will find that just about every album released between 1969 and 1973, 74 has at least one track. The bands have at least one track on their albums that include a drum solo. So not particularly thrilling. However, the rest of the album is really beautiful. Okay, we're going to move on to another Gentle Giant album. This is Octopus. All right, I found that this is the album where Gentle Giant really defined their sound. Rather than having core songs with lots of nice dressing on, just the whole songs become the dressing. Each song is like an experiment already worked out. It's no longer testing the waters. It's like, we got it. We know what we're doing now. So let's see, what does Stephen Lambe have to say about Octopus? It is the most cohesive and balanced album of their career, the most consistent and charming work. We're going to move on a little bit now to the Italian progressive rock scene, which gets a nod with 3 albums here. First one is, actually this is not the first one, this is the first one I got. Le Orme, I guess, with Felona El Sorona. This is a very simple album in a way, because we are looking at basically organ and synthesizer, bass and drums, and a little bit of acoustic guitar. There is not a lot of multi-layering or overdubbing, and I feel that this album could be performed live with the 3 members of the band, plus the bassist either playing acoustic guitar or a guest coming into play for the 2 or 3 tracks that require it. This is a concept album telling the story of 2 planets. One is a very wealthy and prosperous planet, and the other one is a kind of sick and dark planet with the disease and problems. But during the story, there is a kind of role reversal at the end, as I understand it. It is basically the colors of the album cover reflect the mood of the music. There are some cheery parts. There is beauty, but there is also a lot of kind of moody atmosphere. Pardon me for a moment, the cat wants to go out for the 3rd time. Stephen Lambe says that this is a progressive rock power trio in ELP style of the highest order. As my first listen to Italian progressive rock, this was a very nice introduction. I was impressed. And that moved me on to get Premiata Forneria Marconi's album Per un amico. Pardon my Italian. Alright, now this is actually not the album that's mentioned in this book. Photos of Ghosts is what's mentioned in there. I don't have that one, but as I understand, it's the English version roughly based on this one, or based on this one, I'm not sure. But I went with this one here, which has very high ratings on Progressive Rock Archives, Prog Archives. And it's also very enjoyable, easy album to get into. Lots of beautiful music, quite a variety, some great melodies. The only thing to say is, I sometimes feel, and I think Stephen Lambe said a similar comment, or what does he say here? Of all the Italian bands, I recommend PFM as the group to try first, since they have many elements that British fans in particular will find attractive. Yes, and then he also mentions that sometimes there seems to be a little too much going on, and my feeling is, for example, they'll say, let's put in this part with organ, and then we're going to drop down and do this beautiful acoustic guitar part, and then we're going to get into this synthesizer part, and then we're going to go into this drumming part with some piccolo, and then we're going to come back in with some guitar and organ part, and then we're going to bring in some violins doing something, and it just keeps changing and changing like this. So it's like a, a whirlwind tour, where you go here and go here and go here and go here, and it's all good, but you never really stay long enough in one spot. One thing I find, though, is that there's at least one track on here that really reminds me of Harmonium, the progressive rock band from Quebec. And the funny thing is, listening to progressive rock from Quebec, I feel there's a lot of similarity to Italian progressive rock. Must be the Latin connection. One more Italian rock album progressive rock album to cover is Darwin by Banco del Mutuo Soccorso. How am I doing so far? I actually didn't really like this one so much. This was the third one I got, and this is where I kind of put a stop to buying classic Italian progressive rock. However, I listened to it recently, and I found I do quite like it. The only thing is that this album, I think, is from 72, and though the music sounds like it was conceptualized in 1972, the recording sounds like they rehearsed it in 1969, early, and then recorded it in late 69 with the instruments they had used in early 69. So it does have a little bit more rougher touch to it than the kind of smoothness of this one here, the warmth of this one here, but still very interesting and exciting music. What does Stephen Lambe have to say about it? Darwin is a remarkable piece of work, often hard-edged, with a level of complexity. The cat is becoming very restless now and is making a lot of disturbance in the background. But I have two more albums to cover before we finish part 1. And we're going to go on to... what is it called here? Mécanique Destructive Commando by Magma. I think it's their third album. This one comes with a big warning on it because this is completely different from anything else we've talked about so far. First of all, this is... it's a French band. The writer made up an entire language based on basically German or French. And his idea was that he didn't want to make a language that could actually be used as a language, but rather he put sounds together that sounded like words and basically wanted those sounds to come out in the music. Now, John Anderson of Yes did a similar thing, but using English words, and he liked putting words together for the sounds. So that's kind of similar here, but this is a whole new language, quite different. Now you wonder, how would a band go on singing songs in an entirely different language? Well, what they do is they repeat the lines over and over again. So one line will be repeated 8 times, and then another line will come in, and that will be repeated. So in that way, we could say it's repetitive. Also, the music is not meant to be a main feature as with these other groups here. The music is basically a background vehicle supporting the vocals. So you can hear some sax work, you can hear some lead guitar, you can hear the drums and the bass, but it's moving along, holding up the vehicles like a float, holding up the vocals like a float, with the people on the float singing. Now, it's not just one vocalist, they have a cast of vocalists here, including male and female, and it does give it this choir, this chanting choir feel to it, which is attractive. But the one point that really throws me out is somebody is really forcing their voice. And it sounds like this person is suffering from a severe sore throat or laryngitis and is forcing their voice out, and it starts to sound a bit like an operatic chicken. Some people say this is what gives a special touch to the whole thing because it's so out there. For me, it's the point where I might say I'm not sure how much I want to listen to this album. However, I'll probably get into it again later. All right. We have only mentioned Genesis in Trespass so far, and I don't have it. Nursery Crime, Foxtrot, they do get mentioned in the book. However, special mention goes to Selling England by the Pound, which is, I think it's Genesis's most highly rated album and one of the most highly rated albums in progressive rock. I really like it. Firth of Fifth is one of my most favorite Genesis songs. The cat is going absolutely nuts out there right now. I should probably stop recording and pay him some attention soon. But let's just finish this off with comments about what Stephen Lambe has to say about Selling England by the Pound. Let's see here. It is one of the great achievements of the 1970s progressive rock era. It is not perfect, but when it fails, it does so with such style that it is difficult not to love it. Honestly, the only track I have problems with is the Battle of Epping Forest. I've given it a few listens. I just really can't follow along with it. The rest of the songs either good enough or really great. The Cinema Show, Dancing with the Moonlit Night, yeah. Even the other ones like I Know What I Like in Your Wardrobe, More Fool Me. Hey, it's great. Personally, I prefer Nursery Crime and Foxtrot because there are songs in there that I like more. But Firth of Fifth is still a great one, so hard to ignore this one. You can't. Alright, we're going to wrap up part 1 here. We're going to talk about Citizens of Hope and Glory, the story of progressive rock, and more albums behind me in parts 2 and 3. Thanks for watching so far. We'll get back to you in a few weeks, couple of weeks, when I get there. Alright, I gotta give the cat some love. Next time. This, along with King Crimson's In the Court of the Kings and... We now move along to Close to the Edge by Yes. This album, along with In the Court of the King... Oh, for heaven's sake. We now move along to Yes, Close to the Edge. This, along with King Crimson's In the Court of the King... I can't say it! Jeez.